I welcome you to tonight's lecture, Stifling Debate, Reflections on the Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. We are honored to have with us tonight Norman Finkelstein, Professor of Political Science at DePaul University and a preeminent scholar of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Before we begin, I would like to thank our co-sponsor, the ASSU Speakers Bureau, for making this event possible. I also ask that at this time you please silence your cellular phones and pagers. As I'm sure many of you know, yesterday, students confronting apartheid in Israel launched a campaign urging Stanford to selectively divest from companies engaging in practices that violate human rights in the region. For more information about our campaign and to sign our petition, please visit scai.stanford.edu. That's scai.stanford.edu. Tonight's event will consist of a lecture by Professor Finkelstein, followed by a question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you write it down on a note card, which the members of our organization are passing around now on the sides. And when you're done, simply raise your hand so that it can be picked up. If you need an additional note card at any point in the presentation, please raise your hand and a member of our organization will attend to you. We encourage and welcome all questions for Professor Finkelstein in what we hope to be a respectful and thoughtful discussion. At this time, I'd like to introduce Professor Khalil Barhoum, coordinator of the program in Middle Eastern and African Languages and Literature here at Stanford, who will introduce Professor Finkelstein. Please join me in welcoming Professor Barhoum.
Thank you. Good evening. George Orwell once said, "At a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." In the present time, when telling the truth is considered somewhat of a peril, our speaker certainly represents a much-needed breath of fresh air for all of us here. Noam Chomsky has written the following about Norman Finkelstein. He said, "Finkelstein is the author of a number of outstanding books and a great many articles. His image and reality in the Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the most outstanding books on the topic. And when asked to list a single book as a source, this is the one I select. He's a person of great intelligence and insight, as well as unusual integrity, and his work is truly outstanding." End of quote. When asked what motivates him to continue telling the truth about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, without the least bit of hesitation, Finkelstein said, I quote, "I guess it's a personal revulsion of lies, just a personal quirk. I don't like it when people get away with lies. The thing about a lie is that if you don't stop it, it will gain a momentum of its own, and before you know it, it becomes received wisdom." He adds, "I just loathe occupiers. It makes not a whit of difference whether they are Jewish or American. People may not agree on the same ethical system," he adds, "but they can come to the same ethical judgments. Some ethical issues like abortion divide society 50-50. But the kinds of ethical judgments we are asked to make in most conflicts are not controversial. It's not controversial in the world that the murder of innocent people is wrong. If we are dealing with borderline issues like abortion, it is difficult to come to a consensus. But the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not a borderline case. My whole point," he says, "is that for more than 30 years there has been a consensus in the world, 154 to 3, or 160 to 4, That's not borderline. End of quote. On this, ironically, our speaker could have been paraphrasing John Stuart Mill, the 19th century philosopher and economist, who once said, and I quote, "Not the violent conflict between parts of the truth, but the quiet suppression of half of it is the formidable evil. There is always hope when people are forced to listen to both sides. It is when they attend to one that errors harden into prejudice and truth itself ceases to have the effect of truth by being exaggerated into falsehood." End of quote. To help understand Finkelstein, one might consider what he says about one of the most important influences on his intellectual and personal life. I'm speaking of Noam Chomsky, who has been invariably described as one of the greatest intellectuals today and of the 20th century.
He's a Zionist.
In describing some of Chomsky's attributes in the scholarship and personal character traits, Finkelstein seems to be setting an example for himself, both academically and personally. He says, from Professor Chomsky, I got my method of reasoning. Basically, he's able to free himself from ideological controls and go where reasoning and the facts take him, which is easy to say, but difficult to practice. Another interesting aspect of Professor Chomsky, he adds, is that his writing rises above the jargon of the times. Books which were written in the 60s read like they were written yesterday. And then he adds, regarding his personal character traits, the most outstanding is that he absolutely is faithful, which is something very few people possess. Professor Chomsky will never betray you. Never. It is impossible. End of quote. What's left out in this quote is the fact that Chomsky is also a great teacher, whatever you think of him. But so is Finkelstein. Great teachers have the habit of not being afraid to be skeptical, to be controversial, and to be bold in telling it like it is. Take it from another great teacher and role model, Edward Said. In an article published in Al-Ahram Weekly the week of September 10, 1998, titled Bridge Across the Abyss, Said brilliantly outlines the teacher's role and the concomitant fundamental paradox of education. He says, it's much easier for a teacher to try to communicate a sense of his or her authority than to suggest skepticism and a little doubt about what's being said. Far from being a kind of automatic rejectionism, that skepticism is the first step in trying to build a structure across an abyss. If you can't inspire your students to do that, if you can't somehow move them to grasp that education is really self-education and not the unquestioning acceptance of what in the end authority says, then I feel that you have committed them to intellectual and ultimately moral servitude. He goes on to say, the fundamental paradox of education is that you must serve and submit to authority. The authority of tradition, of learning itself, of the scholars and scientists who went before you and in a sense made you possible, and at the same time, you must somehow remain critical, even defiant. And what makes you defiant, what makes it possible for you to build a bridge across the abyss that so many people are defeated by is hope and a belief in a great idea. The ideal of justice, the idea of emancipation, the idea of enlightenment, which of course is where the bridge leads you. There are great risks here, he says, risks of unpopularity, of being isolated, of being reviled. Pamina, in Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, at the moment of greatest danger, sings, "I must say the truth, even if it were a crime." And Said concludes, but in the final analysis, I think there's nothing more noble than to risk all these things in order to be able to build that bridge. It is the genius of the school and university that they provide a place and a few years in which to try and try and try. Of course, one may not fully succeed, but one realizes also that it is the everlasting effort to find a way, build a bridge, imaginatively and critically, that keeps us alive intellectually and democratically. End of quote. It's as if Edward Said wrote these words nearly a decade ago with people like Finkelstein in mind. Our speaker was born in Brooklyn as the son of Marilla Finkelstein, survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, Majdanek concentration camp, and Zacharias Finkelstein, survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto Auschwitz concentration camp. He dedicated his first book to his parents with this statement: "May I never forgive or forget what was done to them." Finkelstein received his doctorate from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. His thesis was on the theory of Zionism. He's the author of 5 books: Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, Verso, 1995, The Rise and Fall of Palestine, University of Minnesota, 96, A Nation on Trial, the Goldhagen Thesis and Historical Truth, Henry Holt, 1998, The Holocaust Industry, Reflections of the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering, Verso, 2000, and Beyond Chutzpah, on the Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Abuse of History, University of California Press, 2005. Additionally, his writings have appeared in journals such as the London Review of Books, Index on Censorship, Journal of Palestine Studies, New Left Review, Middle East Report, Christian Science Monitor, and Al-Ahram Weekly. Currently, he teaches political science at DePaul University in Chicago. Finkelstein once said, "The best guardian against the corruption of power is an educated and committed populace." We could not agree with him more. It is both my pleasure and honor to introduce to you tonight's speaker, Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for inviting me in, and thank you for those very generous introductory remarks. Actually, you said so many things which I would want to comment on, but if I got started in that direction, I would never get to the lecture. So I'll just thank you for the remarks, and maybe at some time in the future we could discuss them further. Can everyone in the back hear me? No problem? Good. Okay. As it happens, the core of my remarks today bears on some of the introductory statements, namely this whole question of why is a controversy, which in fact, if you look at the historical record, you look at the contemporary record, you look at the record for resolving the conflict, that is to say, if you look at the past, the present, and the future, the conflict is really not very controversial at all. And how do we account for the fact that so much controversy swirls around this conflict when, if you look at the documentary record, the factual record, it really isn't either controversial or complicated. I was reading this past week a quite hefty volume by the former head of the Jaffe Center for Security Studies in Tel Aviv, a fellow named Ze'ev Maoz, who, if I'm not mistaken, currently teaches at UC Davis. And he put out a book titled Defending the Holy State, Defending the Holy Land. And at one point he writes, a historian looking at the Arab-Israeli conflict 100 years from now will probably wonder why it took so long to resolve it. Compared to other contemporary conflicts, the Arab-Israeli conflict is probably less severe and probably more soluble than many other conflicts. And that's the essence of what I want to talk about today. Why has it proven so difficult to solve a conflict which, relatively speaking, is not very controversial and, relatively speaking, not very complicated? And the thesis I'm going to argue this evening is that most of the controversy, the preponderance of the controversy that swirls around the Israel-Palestine conflict is contrived, it's fabricated, it's concocted. And the purpose of this artificial controversy is to divert attention from the documentary record and to sow confusion about what that record actually shows. Let me begin with an illustration from recent history. In July 2004, the International Court of Justice, the highest judicial body in the World Court, it rendered an advisory opinion, a landmark opinion, on the legality of the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territory. Now, as it happens, in order for the World Court to render an opinion on the legality of the wall, it had to explore the legality of all the issues pertaining to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which are said to be the most controversial. For those of you who are familiar with the jargon of the conflict, they are called the final status issues, which is to say, we're told that they are so complicated and so intricate that discussion of them has to be deferred to the last stage of negotiations. And those typical final status issues are, one, the borders of a future Palestinian state, two, the status of the settlements, three, Jerusalem, a fourth, which I'll get to later, is the refugees. Those are the final status issues. As I said, it happens that in order for the World Court to render judgment on the legality of the wall, it had to render judgment on all of those, apart from the refugees, all of those final status questions. And its findings were as follows. On the question of borders of the future Palestinian state and future Israeli state, it said, it's clear under international law that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. That principle is anchored in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, and therefore Israel has no title to any of the territory it conquered in the West Bank or Gaza during the June 1967 war. That is to say, to use the language of the World Court, those are occupied Palestinian territories for the purpose of the exercise of Palestinian self-determination. For our purposes, that means, contrary to what you routinely read or hear in the United States, those are not disputed territories. Those are occupied Palestinian territories, full stop. The question of the settlements. The World Court ruled under Article 49, Paragraph 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the settlements constitute a flagrant violation of international law. All 400,000 settlers in the West Bank and Jerusalem are living there in flagrant violation of international law. Number 3, we're often told how complicated and complex is the question of East Jerusalem. Israel indeed claims East Jerusalem as part of its eternal and undivided capital. The World Court said it's not complicated at all. East Jerusalem is conquered territory from the June 1967 war. Ergo, it is occupied Palestinian territory. Full stop. The wall itself, when it came to rule on the legality of the wall, it said, as most of you know, the wall must be dismantled, compensation paid, and the international community is obliged to enforce this decision. That's the ruling. What's interesting, or of equal interest to the ruling, is the vote. The vote on the wall was not close. It was not a split decision. The vote was 14-1. And I'll get to the one in a moment, the American judge Thomas Bergendahl. The vote was 14-1. On all those complicated, intricate, final status issues, there was, and I would urge you to look at the decision, there was no debate or dispute. It's interesting, I've been reading a lot of international court decisions. If you download the one on Nicaragua, the 1984 decision, it comes, if you include the majority decision, the separate opinions, the dissents, and the declarations, it comes to something like 1,000 pages. You go to the World Court decision on the legality of nuclear weapons, an important decision in 1996. If you include the majority opinion, the separate opinions, the dissents, and so forth, it comes to about 300 or 400 pages. But when you come to the decision on the wall, the whole decision is less, including the dissents, separate opinions, and so forth, it comes to less than 100 pages. It simply was not controversial. Even if you take the one dissenting vote, namely the one by Thomas Bergendahl, the American judge on the court, he does not call his comment a dissent. He calls it, in the jargon of the court, he calls it a declaration. In a court, you have the majority opinion Then you have the separate opinions of those who agree with the majority opinion but for different reasons. Then you have dissents, those who completely agree and disagree. And then you have the middling position, which is called a declaration. Bergenthal did not call it a dissent. He issued a declaration. And he begins his declaration by saying that he agrees with much of the majority opinion. And he goes on to say that he agrees that the settlements that Israel has built, he agrees. Under Article 49, they are plainly illegal. And he goes on to say, if the wall being built is to protect these illegal settlements, then it is ipso facto, using his words, is ipso facto illegal as well. Well, the Israel High Court, several months later, acknowledged the wall was being built in order to incorporate the settlements. In which case, every judge on the World Court agreed on its fundamental illegality. It's just not controversial in the real world. And so you have that striking conclusion that on 3 of the 4, as I say, I'll return to the refugees question, on 3 of the 4 controversial final status questions, the highest judicial body in the world, there's no dissent, there's no debate, there is no dispute. And I might add at this point that, in fact, it illustrates from another direction how uncontroversial the supposedly controversial conclusions of Jimmy Carter's recent book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, how uncontroversial his conclusions are. His main conclusions are: 1, Israel must withdraw to the June 1967 borders, and 2, that the main obstacle to peace in the Middle East is Israel's unwillingness to comply with international law. As you'll see in a moment, that's absolutely uncontroversial, even though his book is called very controversial. And that is preliminary to now what I want to look at more closely, to look at the record and to see whether my claim holds up when you look at the actual documentary record, the factual record. So let's look at a few examples. Let's start with the historical record. For those of you who are roughly of my age cohort, you will know for sure that the most controversial historical question bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the factual controversy, has always been the one of how did the Palestinians become refugees in 1948? It was always a point of great contention. The standard answer, or the standard response, which most of you are no doubt familiar with, was that in 1948, the Arab armies poised to attack the newly born state of Israel, transmitted orders to the Arabs of Palestine to flee from their homes, and after the victory of the armies, they would win, to clear the fields of the Arab armies. And in most mainstream scholarship, that particular interpretation was the standard one. There was a group on the periphery who said it wasn't true, but they had relatively little influence in academic, let alone media life. Well, come the late 1980s, Israeli scholars preeminently, but others as well, go through the Israeli archives, and they reach the conclusion, to quote now the most preeminent of those scholars, namely a fellow named Benny Morris. He says that, well, the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. And now if you look at the broad consensus, I won't say complete, but the broad consensus among scholars, that's pretty much where things stand. There is debate, but the debate is very narrow. The debate now is, was this ethnic cleansing premeditated, or was it born of the war? In Benny Morris's famous phrase, the Palestinians became refugees. It was born of war, not by design. And others say not true. It was premeditated. It's interesting to see how narrow the debate has become. So take the case of Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who is a trained historian, a smart fellow for sure. And he wrote a book last year. It was called Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. He looks at the historical evidence, and Shlomo Ben-Ami, the former foreign minister, he says it's true, for sure, Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. But he says, I disagree with Benny Morris. I think it was premeditated. I think it was anchored in Zionist ideology, the ethnic cleansing in 1948. So now you have a case where a former foreign minister, one of the Israelis who negotiated in 2000 at Camp David, is already at the extreme left end of this relatively narrow spectrum. Let's look at the current record. When you speak about the current record of the Israel-Palestine conflict, it mostly means the human rights record. And here you have another interesting case, because on its surface, you would expect that there would be lots of controversy on Israel's human rights record in the occupied territories. Number one, human rights law is a relatively new branch of international law, and there are still a lot of gray areas. The application of terms and the relevance of terms. Number two, there are a large slew of human rights organizations monitoring the Israel-Palestine conflict. The big international ones like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and then a whole slew of local ones on the Israeli side, the Palestinian side, the best known being, I think, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. Number three, a lot of human rights work is vulnerable to human error. That is to say, a lot of human rights work consists of, there's a demonstration in some city in the occupied Palestinian territories. Human rights workers go out to observe what's happening. And so there's a crowd like this, divided roughly in half. On one side, the Israeli soldiers, on the other side, the Palestinian demonstrators. And a typical human rights worker will have to observe the demonstration. He or she turns first to the Palestinian side. Did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or live ammunition? And if they used live ammunition, were they on the periphery of the crowd or were they in the midst of the crowd? And then they turn to the Israeli side, the soldiers, and they have to ask the question, did the Israelis initiate the clash? And if they did they first fire warning shots? And if they did they then aim at the legs, or did they aim at the torso and the head? And so on and so forth. And as most of you, this is a sophisticated Stanford audience, so most of you know the famous Kurosawa film, Rashomon. And knowing Rashomon, you all know about the frailties and fallibilities of memory. And you would expect different human rights workers observing the same demonstration, they'll see different things. They will remember it differently. So you have human rights law filled with gray areas, many human rights organizations doing work on the same topic, You have the frailties and fallibilities of human memory. You would expect on its surface there would be lots of controversy on Israel's human rights record. Well, as it happened for the last book I wrote, I went through probably on the order of thousands and perhaps as many as 10,000 pages of human rights reports on the Israel-Palestine conflict for the past 20 years. And what was very striking to me, and I have a pretty careful eye, I was kind of shocked. Over the 20-year period, I was only able to find one case of one demonstration on one day, on one afternoon, where two human rights organizations disagreed about what happened. There was complete and total unanimity. There was no controversy whatsoever about Israel's real human rights record in the occupied territories. Let's take a couple of examples. Let's look at the question of fatalities. As all of you know, led by the United States, the international community has conditioned recognition of Hamas on, among other things, its renunciation of terrorism. In my view, as a demand, it's perfectly legitimate. Terrorism is illegal under international law, and one is obliged to renounce the resort to it. But, as everyone in this room knows, if you apply a principle across the board, it's a moral principle. If you apply it to one side, it's a hypocritical principle. So let's see what those human rights organizations have to say on this question. If you look at the statistics for the numbers killed during the Second Intifada, I checked last night. The latest figures are 4,046 Palestinians killed, 1,017 Israelis killed, a ratio of almost exactly 4-to-1. In fact, more Palestinian children have been killed, 811, than the total number of Israeli civilians killed, 701. On both sides, the numbers are roughly 1/2 to 2/3 civilians killed. Now, most people won't dispute these numbers, not very controversial. There's a range, for sure. I'm using the best-selling figures. But the argument is usually made that there's a difference between Palestinian killings, which target Israeli civilians, and Israeli killings, although 4 times as many, but which don't target Palestinians. They are, as it were, collateral damage. What do the human rights organizations say? They all agree that Israel's use of live ammunition is excessive, indiscriminate, and, on many occasions, deliberately targeting civilians. Well, what about those indiscriminate killings of Palestinians? Do they rise to the standard of intentional killings, or is it still different? But not according to human rights law. There's a basic legal principle that the doer of any act must be taken to have intended its natural and foreseeable consequences. So if you indiscriminately fire into a crowd, then it's taken that you intentionally killed those who died in the course of the indiscriminate firing. It's intentional. You are responsible for the foreseeable and natural consequences of your act. That's not a radical opinion. I'll quote you the president of Tel Aviv University, Yoram Dinstein, a very distinguished legal scholar, Israel's preeminent scholar of international law. in one of his standard studies on international law, he writes, "There is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians," what Hamas is accused of, that's my interpolation. "There is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians and a reckless disregard of the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants," which is what human rights organizations say Israel routinely is involved in. He says, quote, "They are equally forbidden. They're the same under international law." Well, where does that leave us? The only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are: one, Israeli terrorism is 4 times as lethal, statistically. And 2, no demand is being put on Israel to renounce terrorism as a condition for international acceptance. That's called hypocrisy. I don't think that's particularly complicated if you look at the actual record as assembled by human rights organizations. Let's turn to the third aspect, the future. How do you resolve the conflict? Is that complicated? Well, as Mr. Barhoun mentioned in the introductory remarks, for the past 30 years, there has been an international consensus for resolving the conflict. Everyone in this room knows it. It's called the two-state settlement. A full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967, in accordance with that principle articulated most recently by the World Court, that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war, a full Israeli withdrawal on the one side, and recognition of Israel's right to live in peace with its neighbors on the other side. Again, it's remarkable how uncontroversial it is over a very sustained period of time. 1989, when the General Assembly voted on the two-state settlement, the vote was 151-3, with 1 abstention. The negative votes, the United States, Israel, and the island state of Dominica. You then fast forward to this past year. So we're talking about 17 years later. 17 years which have witnessed very significant geopolitical changes in the world's map. In the past, since 1989, 40 new states have been born. The United Nations now has 192 states. In 1989, it had 154. Significant changes politically. The Soviet system has disappeared. But on this particular question, states may come and go, governments may radically change, but there's been remarkable stability. So I checked yesterday evening, because the votes are typically in the Palestine question, they come in December in the General Assembly. What was the vote this past year on the two-state settlement? It was 157-7. What were the 7 dissenting countries? Every year you can check and you'll see it's always the same. The United States, Israel, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. This year there was a slight change. Tuvalu dropped out, and Australia dropped in. But that's it. These are not what should be obvious. These are not close votes. Which brings us to another question. Namely, I mentioned a moment ago that the first condition put on Hamas was the elected government of the elected Palestinian government in January 2006. The first condition was they had to renounce terrorism. And the second condition was they must recognize the state of Israel. To my thinking, perfectly legitimate and not very controversial. Israel is a member state of the United Nations, has, like every other member state, the right to live in peace with its neighbors. The problem is, once again, that principle. Namely, if you make a demand on every party to the conflict, it's a moral, ethical principle. If you make it on one side, it's hypocrisy. No Israeli government, no Israeli political party, no Israeli public official has ever recognized the Palestinian state within the borders affirmed by countless UN resolutions and the World Court decision. That is to say, no Israeli state, no Israeli political party, official, government has ever affirmed a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied in June 1967. As the world demands that Hamas recognize Israel, the current Israeli government is building a wall that annexes about 10% of the West Bank illegally, annexes East Jerusalem illegally, effectively trisects the West Bank into 3 parts. In addition, Israel is severing the West Bank from Gaza, ethnically cleansing the Jordan Valley, and has de facto annexed the Jordan Valley. What are the Palestinians being offered? The British economist says the Palestinians have been asked to choose between a Swiss cheese state comprising most of the West Bank but riddled with settlements, and Israel pulling out from about 40 to 50% of the West Bank unilaterally while keeping most of its settlements. But no demand is put on Israel, only on Hamas. The differences between Israel and Hamas are, first, although Hamas has been ambiguous on its willingness to recognize Israel on the pre-June 67 borders, it goes hot and cold. I'm not going to dispute that. Hamas' stand has been ambiguous, but Israel's stand hasn't been ambiguous at all. It has always categorically opposed a Palestinian state on the June 1967 borders. And secondly, the only other difference, as far as I can tell, is that while Hamas sometimes speaks about destroying the Jewish state, Israel is in practice dismembering the Palestinian state. Those are the only differences. That's, as far as I can tell, I always am happy to be corrected, as far as I can tell, that's the documentary record. Pretty straightforward, uncomplicated, and doesn't cast Israel in the best of lights. And it's because it doesn't cast Israel in the best of lights that so much controversy is fabricated in order to distract attention from and sow confusion about that uncomplicated documentary record. Before I look at the contrived controversy, I want to say first a few words about, for lack of a better term, I would call the legitimate controversy. So I think there is a portion of of controversy surrounding the conflict I would consider legitimate. Let me give you an example of what I take to be legitimate controversy, namely the question of the refugees. On the first and most elementary level, people can agree on facts, but render radically different judgments on those facts. Take the case of that historian I mentioned earlier, Benny Morris. He acknowledges that Israel committed an ethnic cleansing in 1948. But he says, I think that ethnic cleansings can be good things. I don't think they're always bad things. He says, take North America. Had it not been, now I'm using his word, had it not been for the annihilation of the native population, you couldn't have had that great American republic. So the annihilation was a good thing. In the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, he says that Ben-Gurion's main error in 1948, the Israeli first prime minister, Ben-Gurion's main error in 1948 was that he didn't cleanse Palestine of every last Arab. That was his mistake. Or you can take the case of Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, who says that ethnic cleansing is a fifth-rate human rights issue analogous to massive urban renewal. Well, you can't say those moral judgments are wrong in the same way as you could say facts are wrong. You could say they are Nazi moral judgments, but you can't say that they are factually
How about the communist moral judgments?
A lot of them are pretty bad too.
Yeah, let's wait for the shit here.
Okay, I'm glad you're putting those judgments in the same category as Stalin's. I think I win that point then. Now, you can agree on the facts, you can agree in your moral judgments, you can agree in your legal judgments, but you can still disagree in your political judgments. That one sounds a little bit more difficult. So let's take an example. Let's use those refugees again. You can agree that factually they were ethnically cleansed in 1948. You can agree that morally it's an abomination. You can agree that legally they have the right of return. But you can say politically, as Professor Chomsky does, you can say politically, I don't think it's going to happen. And he says, if it's not a realistic possibility, then to give people hope when there's no grounds for hope is itself immoral. That's a political judgment. And I think honest people can agree to disagree on that question. Because political judgment is just that. It's judgment. You have to weigh a large number of factors. And weighing that multiplicity of factors, you can reach different conclusions from other people weighing those same factors. Doesn't make you an enemy. It's a legitimate and an honest difference. If you truly believe it's not possible, it won't happen, and I think Professor Chomsky's conclusion follows. It then becomes immoral to give people hope when there's no grounds for it. If, on the other hand, you think it is feasible, then of course you should fight for it. However, and I want to emphasize this point, I said the political judgment and differences around it is legitimate. There is no legitimate disagreement on the legal question. That is to say, there is simply no dispute that under international law, Palestinians have the right of return. The vote in the General Assembly in 2002 on the right of return, 158 to 1. The vote in 2003 on the right of return, 167 to 1. Human rights organizations. Let's take mainstream ones, not controversial ones. Human Rights Watch, 2000. It urges Israel to recognize the right of return. I'm quoting them. Amnesty International, 2001. It calls for Palestinians to be able, I'm quoting them, calls for Palestinians to be able to exercise the right of return. It's not controversial at all. Nonetheless, I do think, as I said, there are areas, at least in the question of its practical implementation, where honest people can disagree. What I want to turn to now is that much larger area on the Israel-Palestine conflict, where I don't think the differences or the controversies are legitimate at all. That they're simply fabricated and concocted. They have no bearing on the real world. They're fabricated and concocted in order to divert attention and sow confusion. Let me give you a few examples. First is this attempt to mystify the conflict, to claim that it's so complicated, so intricate, that it requires the equivalent of rocket science to penetrate its mysteries. It's about primordial, irreconcilable shepherds' wars. It's about a cosmic clash of religions and civilizations. Well, what's the purpose of this mystification? The first purpose of it is to convince the observer that he or she should suspend his or her ordinary ethical, legal judgments because the conflict is too complicated. A typical example, there's a fellow, Robert Malley, a very decent guy. He was one of the American negotiators at Camp David, no, he wasn't at Camp David in 2000. And at a public forum about a year ago, he was asked, why is it that U.S. aid to Israel continues to flow despite Israel's egregious human rights record? And he said, well, this is a really and truly unique conflict. And the fact that it's really and truly unique somehow means we apply a different moral standard to it. And the other purpose of this claim of the uniqueness and the complexity and the intricacy of the conflict is to get the observer not to make the obvious analogies between this conflict and others. We're always told, don't compare, because this conflict is so different, so much more complicated, so don't compare. Well, the reason is obvious, because whenever you compare the Israel-Palestine conflict with other obvious cases, Israel always comes out on the wrong side. So don't compare. Historically, you can make a reasonable analogy. I won't say it's perfect, but if it were perfect, it wouldn't be an analogy. It would simply be a mirror image. You can make a reasonable analogy between the fate of Native Americans in North America and the fate of Palestinians in the course of the Zionist conquest of Palestine. In fact, as I mentioned ago, it wasn't a coincidence that that was the example Benny Morris immediately leapt to. There's an obvious analogy there. Not perfect, but still obvious. The problem is, Israel comes out on the wrong side of the analogy. So don't compare. The Israel-Palestine conflict is unique. Or take not historically, but currently. The obvious analogy is this one, the one with apartheid in South Africa. Now, no aspect of Carter's book, former President Jimmy Carter's book, has evoked more outrage than its identification of Israeli policy in the occupied territories with apartheid. The Washington Post called it, namely the apartheid analogy, foolish and unfair. The Boston Globe called it irresponsibly provocative. The New York Times said